a number of familiar faces back from elsewhere off campus. And I'd have just a few more remarks before I turn it over to the interesting part of the seminar with our speaker. But first, I guess, especially for a number of the students who are here for their first year on campus, want to say a few words about this lectureship and the fund. So we're very fortunate to have this lecture series that's been going on for more than a decade because of the generosity of the Shah Family Fund, a fund that was established here at Stanford. Haresh Shah is up front here. Those of you who haven't met him yet, corner him and say hi on the way out, introduce yourself. This is a photo here of Haresh with his wife Joan and his sons Hemant and me here. Haresh was a professor in the department for many years, chair of the department, and I think if we back up in time to when he was a professor, so here's one of our favorite action shots from post-1989 Loma Prieta earthquake, when Professor Shah kind of snapped to action and spearheaded a lot of the building inspections on campus and taking groups of students around to help assess buildings and figure out kind of where the campus stood in the aftermath of the earthquake. I've even heard from neighbors of mine who lived on campus at the time in his neighborhood that he was over at their houses kind of checking things out and trying to identify kind of causes of differential damage among the neighborhood and things. I like to think about that. So this is the 1989 earthquake. 1989 was also kind of an important milestone in that was the year that Risk Management Solutions was founded. So Haresh was, Professor Shah was one of the founders of that company along with his son Hemant. And in the years since 1989, it's grown into kind of the global leader in catastrophe risk modeling. More than 1,000 employees around the globe and really a pioneer in many ways in kind of risk analysis from natural disasters and now kind of many other types of risks dealt with in many ways in the insurance industry. From the generosity of the Shah family, we now have a number of kind of exciting opportunities here. So we have this lecture fund where we're able to kind of have these very interesting dialogues with global leaders in catastrophe risk modeling. And we've brought in kind of a number of very distinguished and interesting speakers to give us ideas about the general field of catastrophe risk. I'll note also there's many other opportunities funded by the Shah family. There are a number of people in the room, I'm certain, are recipients of the Shah Family Fellowships that provides financial support for graduate student researchers. There's a staff award that some of our staff have won, available to Stanford University staff, and there's some other awards for young researchers globally in the field of catastrophe risk analysis. So in many ways, the community benefits greatly from this generosity, and tonight here we're here to kind of take advantage of this the Shah Family Lecture. So thanks to Haresh and his family for this opportunity that we have. So here I'll turn the page to our speaker now this evening. It's my real pleasure to introduce Jim Blackburn. So Jim has an interesting background. He has a bachelor's degree in history and then a JD. So he's a licensed attorney. His degrees are from University of Texas at Austin. He then went back and got a master's of science in environmental science from Rice University. And he's been working as an environmental lawyer and environmental planner for many decades since getting those credentials. Currently, he's a professor of the practice at Rice University, and he teaches environmental law. He's in the Civil and Environmental Engineering Department, and he teaches courses in sustainable design there. He's also the co-director of the Severe Storm Prediction, Education, and Evacuation from Disasters Center at Rice University. And he's a Rice Faculty Scholar at the Baker Institute, as well as working in private practice with a planning firm that he owns and also as a litigator. He's authored a number of books as a scholar. So his 2004 book, the Book of Texas Bays, focused on the environmental health of Texas bays. Last year, he issued a new book, A Texas Plan for the Texas Coast, which is focusing on planning around protecting the coastline in Texas. He's won a number of awards for his work in various ways. I'll name a few. The Barbara C. Jordan Community Advocate Award was presented to him by the Texas Southern University. He received the National Conservation Achievement Award from the National Wildlife Federation, and the Bob Eckert Lifetime Achievement Award for coastal preservation efforts from the General Land Office of the state of Texas. We came across Jim following some of his public work related to Hurricane Harvey and land use planning and engineering issues around Harvey. And when I reached out to a colleague at Rice to ask about him, she noted that one of his key roles as a co-director in the SPEED Center, the Storm Prediction Center that he co-leads, is integrating scholarship with pragmatism and community engagement, in her words. We thought that was kind of an interesting position to be in as kind of a scholar who's really working at the forefront of kind of implementation and planning and working with the communities. And given his kind of long expertise in environmental law and his work at the center, he's really been an important figure in the media since Hurricane Harvey. I noted the New York Times recently called him a lightning rod in a feature about Hurricane Harvey because he's been warning Texas for many years about the risks it faces from climate change and unregulated development. And these issues have really come to the forefront in the past year because of this hurricane in particular. And so we thought, given Professor Blackburn's academic and implementation leadership, his vision for management of climate change risks, and his on-the-ground experience with Hurricane Harvey, the department felt he was really excellently suited to deliver this year's Shah Distinguished Lecture. So Jim, welcome, and we look forward to hearing from you this afternoon. My pleasure. Thank you, Jim.
Well, thank you very much, Jack, and it's a real pleasure to be here and have the opportunity to talk a bit about a subject that I'm coming to talk about quite a lot, Hurricane Harvey, or Tropical Storm Harvey. It was both. And what I would tell you is that Harvey is probably going to be one of the most studied and most talked about storms of certainly the recent past, but I think in a way it's going to be a landmark storm. Certainly is for Houston, but I think also for much of the United States. What I hope to do today is to introduce you a little bit to Houston and then talk about our obsolete 100-year flood, some of our engineered efforts to address flooding in Harris County, talk about how we handled information with Harvey, and I think it's going to be particularly interesting. I think this is one of the places where earthquake thinking and hurricane thinking really come together. Living with flooding in Houston and then empowering the people as a part of the design concept. So these are the general ideas that I want to cover. I think you probably know where Houston is on the Gulf Coast. We are very flat. This is a map on the far side over there about elevation. Much of the red and yellow area you see is going to be 30 feet or less of elevation. Most of Harris County probably is in the 60 to 70 foot range. Rice University, which is somewhere about right in there, is about 45 feet of elevation. Rainfall-wise, we get somewhere between 45 and 50 inches of rain per year. We got all of that in 4 days with Harvey. So it was quite an amazing event to live through. Harris County is where Houston is. I'll show you a map in a minute that will actually talk about the boundaries. We have a lot of small watersheds. We do not have a single large river running through Houston. We have a lot of small watersheds, and they rise and fall very quickly. So we can have a 100-year storm that affects us for 12, 24 hours, and it'll be up and down and be gone the next day. And it's almost like, well, what happened? It's very difficult to sort of explain how fast these storms can come and go and how fast the floods can. But there's 22 of these watersheds, and everything about Harris County flooding is going to be related in one way or another to these watersheds and the way in which they work, and they all work a bit differently. This is a map of sort of the jurisdiction of Houston. The large yellow area is the city of Houston. We have some smaller cities that are outliers, and then a lot of smaller cities over near the bay. And then there's sort of this spaghetti-looking stuff up here. This is strip annexation that Houston did. Houston looked at the rest of the United States and said, we don't want to be hemmed in by a bunch of small cities. And so we strip annexed out and then reserved an area, which is shown in red, for future annexation. We have 640 square miles within the city of Houston, probably another 2,000 square miles reserved for annexation. And then when development came into these areas, it was basically no other city can incorporate in this area because it's 5 miles away from these little strips of yellow. And that's how this land was preserved for annexation. There's over 2 million people that live in these purple areas up here. These are not cities, these are utility districts. These are districts that were formed to basically build roads for developers to build sewage treatment plants, water supply systems. They are developer districts. They really have no government. We have voluntary fire departments. You have the county sheriff. The point being, we've got the probably fourth or fifth largest city in Texas in the unincorporated area of Harris County, and it's not a city at all. It's just where people live. And it's a very bizarre situation that really kind of fell apart to some extent during Harvey. There are other bizarre things about Texas. This is the Florida governor, but he and the Texas governor share the fact they don't believe in climate change. That's something just to note of. And our Harris County Flood Control District does not recognize that climate change is occurring. So we've got the federal, the state, and the local government all denying climate change in the midst of what I would say is probably the single largest climate change-inspired storm that we've ever had in perhaps United States history. This and Sandy. So it's quite fascinating to watch these dynamics try to play. It's sort of like trying to solve this problem with one arm tied behind our backs, but that's where we are. 100-year flood. I'm sure all of you have heard about the 100-year flood, given to us by the federal government through the Federal Flood Insurance Program. That is the standard that was developed there. We've had many 100-year floods. They seem to occur with great rapidity. People in Harris County laugh when they hear the term 100-year flood. We just had a 100-year flood. Yeah, right, okay. Yeah, it just has no meaning anymore. Allison in 2001 was really the first of the, we had a 1994 storm that was quite large, but Allison was the one that really just kind of blew our sockets. That was in 2001. This is Harris County Flood Control's report. And by the way, this is a rainfall over here. This part of Harris County got 25 inches in 12 hours. That's a lot of rain and massive flooding, if you can imagine. I think it was about 70,000 houses flooded in Harris County with Allison. But this is a report. Look at the title, Off the Charts. If you were designing from the standpoint of a climate scientist, how you would describe climate change related storm events, you'd look at the bell curve and it'd be off the chart. That's the name they chose, but they don't recognize climate change. Some strange ironies. Tax Day flood. We had a cold front. This isn't a tropical storm. This is a cold front that just sort of stalled coming through. Low pressure system coming down, bringing cold weather and stopped. Didn't move. Dropped. Basically record amounts of rainfall in every one of these streams that you see outlined in color here. Several of the rainfall areas or rainfall gauges were at a 10,000-year mark for this storm. Many others were at the 500, virtually the entire county was at the 100-year level for this storm. 2016. Then Harvey. Harvey blew the circuits. 50 inches in 4 days. The 500-year storm for Houston or Harris County is 21 inches in 4 days. We had 42 to 50. You're not supposed to be doubling the 500-year storm. It's just not supposed to happen, but it did. There is a study that's been commissioned to look at our increase in rainfall. It does include Harvey, but it goes all the way back about 60 years. And we are one of the areas, this whole green swath in Texas, much of the coastal area of Texas, all the way across the central part through Austin, all of these areas have an increased 100-year rainfall event based on statistical analysis by the NOAA Atlas 14 study. For Harris County, we're going to be increasing our 100-year flood from 13 inches in 24 hours to probably somewhere in the 16 to 17 inch in 24 hours range. That's pretty well established. Now the real question is whether they're going to try to take any climate change into consideration in projection, how to use this 100-year. I'm betting they do not, and that this will be just left at this point, which means we might catch up to some extent, but we're not going to get in front of this issue of the changing 100-year storm. The point being, we have a map called the 100-year floodplain. It is obsolete and it is dangerous. And we don't know what to do. We are almost helpless. In the interim, we have adopted for the county the 500-year level to use from a building code standpoint. The city is now debating going to the 500-year storm as an interim. But there's more involved than that. If you look at all of the infrastructure, ultra-hazardous chemical facilities are cited with regard to the 100-year event. Public water supply is cited for 100-year. Wastewater treatment plants. Hazardous waste storage, treatment, and disposal facilities are located based on the 100-year event. Landfills, highways, freeways. This is a standard design that we use not only for buildings and commercial structures, but for all of these really significant infrastructure items. This is a map just showing, relative to the 100-year flood shown in yellow in this one, where our existing and past sanitary landfills are, many of which were built with levees to protect from the 100-year. This is a map of our wastewater treatment facilities. We have a lot because of all those little purple areas you saw. Every one of those, at one time or another, had their own treatment plants. They now share some, but we have a lot. We have like 500 treatment plants around the Houston region, most of which are right in the edge or protected from the 100-year by a levee. So, what do you do with this? Well, I thought I'd look at the American Society of Civil Engineers Canons of Ethics. You're an engineer. I'm sure there's a few civil engineers floating around here. You're going to locate something, an ultra-hazardous facility. The law says you have to follow the 100-year, you have to design to meet the 100-year flood. Well, it's a map, right? It's that map, that yellow area. Officially, it's a 100-year flood. It's worthless, but it's the official map. Do you build to it? Is that your standard? Well, what does the Canon of Ethics say about that? Shall recognize the lives, safety, health, and welfare of the general public are dependent upon engineering judgments, decisions, and practices incorporated into structures, machines, product, processes, and devices. Well, that's kind of a sobering statement. Engineers shall approve or seal only those design documents which are determined to be safe for public health and welfare. Well, arguably, someone decided the 100-year 1% level was safe, but that map's worthless. Seal that document or not. Engineers, oh, and by the way, in conformity with accepted engineering standards. That might be the loophole that kind of provides a little relief there. Engineers whose professional judgment is overruled under circumstances where the safety, health, and welfare of the public are endangered shall inform their clients or employers of the possible consequences. Now, I'm raising this because Houston's run by engineers. We are a town of engineers. My favorite saying, not particularly well liked by the engineering community, we're over-engineered and under-planned. We have a tremendous number of engineering devices, designs. Texas law basically says the duty of a licensed professional engineer is to protect the public of the state of Texas. I just spoke at the Speed Center conference, and we was attended by about 200 engineers, and I told them that I was their client, that I'm the public. And you could have heard a pin drop. That was not what they wanted to hear. But I think the question I'm raising is, how do engineers fit into this whole, kind of, if you will, this whole problem we've got of getting ourselves out of a mess that we're right in the middle of in Houston, and I would argue probably much of the coastal United States. How about climate? Climate's changing. Speed Center just finished a conference in February 2018. Every climate scientist that spoke said, climate's changing, rainfall patterns are changing, we have not seen the worst yet, and we cannot predict particularly well what's coming, but we know it will be bigger and worse than what we have seen. Because the ocean's heating up, the ocean is the fuel for tropical storms and hurricanes, evaporation is increasing, and the jet stream's vacillating, all climate related, all of which were implicated in Harvey. It was not a question if Harvey was ever going to occur again, but simply when and where. That was the question. So, I want to give you a lawyer's understanding of the bell curve. All familiar with the bell curve of standard distribution. That's where Tropical Storm Allison falls, 2001. That's where the tax day storm falls. That was 2016. That's where Harvey falls, 2017. The best discussion of the bell curve I ever saw, a stockbroker or stock analyst was talking about the bell curve, and he drew these two red lines and put TBD up there. And what does TBD mean? To be determined? Well, that doesn't make a lot of sense. There be dragons. There are dragons at the edge of the bell curve. And that's where we are. We're at the edge of the bell curve. And we are looking at climate dragons. And it could be a bad drought on one side. It could be severe storm events on the other. And we're not dealing honestly with that reality. And that is going to cripple Houston's recovery until we start actually treating it well. I think it'll cripple every coastal town in the United States and probably the world if we don't talk about it. So how does climate change relate to the engineer's duty? The engineer have a duty to talk about climate change? I mean, in Houston, we're dealing with the fact that neither the state nor the local government accept that climate's changing. Any obligation to talk about it? To protect the public? How about some of our engineered efforts to protect? This is a bayou called Brays Bayou. I'll show you in a second. Well, let me do it here. Brays Bayou is this watershed right here. This is downtown Houston. Rice University is about right in here. Texas Medical Center here, downtown is here. And Brays Bayou kind of comes along like this. It used to be a very small, kind of meandering stream. It was channelized in the 1950s. This is what it looks like today. This is what it looked like during Harvey. This last one, the bottom one, the water extends a long way in each direction beyond Brays Bayou. Brays Bayou is a very dangerous water body today. This is the development that occurred within Brays Bayou. In 1970, it was about a little less than half developed. By 2010, it had been virtually 100%. I think it's 95% developed. 700,000 people live in the Brays Bayou watershed. This is what the flow has done over time on Brays Bayou. Going back to the 30s, USGS basically peak flows. Steady increase. Phil Bedient, who is the co-director of the Severe Storm Center with me at Rice, basically made his career studying the increase in peak flows along Brays Bayou with development over time. This is what Brays Bayou looked like in an undeveloped condition for the 1% storm, probably going back into the 1930s. Basically a very slow, very flat flood. Peak flow, max about 8,000 cubic feet per second. This is what this is what it was in 2004. 33,000, 34,000 cubic feet per second. That's human impacts on peak flooding. That's urban impact, that's the impacts of urbanization on stream flow. It is horrific to watch it happen, to see it happen. But we have engineered it. You know, we basically thought we were protected with a stream channel that was channelized by the Corps of Engineers, and it was channelized to a 200-year level. That channel no longer holds a 10-year flood. We have lost that capacity because we kept increasing the flows being dumped into it to the point that we overwhelmed the system. And at least in our community, we were unable to develop land use controls in a timely manner to stop that, to retain that runoff. Today, here's what we're looking at. This is back in 1990, based on land use from the 1980s. That dark blue area is the 100-year floodplain. After Tropical Storm Allison, we redid all of our 100-year floodplains. And the light blue area is the area that was added to the 100-year floodplain because of the impact of upstream development. So physically, we have expanded the area to be flooded because of our development practices. Now, that basically happened without a lot of public concern, without a lot of public statement. But this happened not only on this watershed, that happened in 22 watersheds in Harris County. We basically just about doubled the amount of land in the 100-year floodplain in that time period because of the impacts of development. And of course, we came up with proposals to fix this problem. This is again for Braes Bayou. And these are just various proposals that have been made for various improvements along the channel, certain off-stream channel work that has been proposed. $500 million project, which is about half completed today. This is the projection of what will happen to the 100-year floodplain when that project is completed. We're going to collapse the floodplain. We're going to move it from this larger area here, which is in this map. If you're familiar with Houston, I think this is primarily the Bel Air, Mileland area that has been hit so hard with flooding. That area will see its floodplain diminished to about this blue area. This is what's called a CLOMR. This is a conditional letter of map revision that has been prepared to be submitted to the Federal Emergency Management Agency to change the 100-year floodplain map as soon as this work is completed. However, we're going to increase the 100-year flood. Remember I told you that NOAA Atlas 14 study is coming, and so we're going to basically add 4 more inches to our 100-year rainfall. So about the time we collapse this floodplain and remap it, we're going to come out with new information that's going to increase it. And then we're going to increase it again and again and again. We're not being truthful about the type of problems that we're experiencing in the urban area. And I think part of this has to do with our reluctance to be honest about flooding. I think the worst thing we ever did was name the Harris County Flood Control District just that, a district to control flooding. I don't think you're going to control flooding in this era. You're not going to control 42 inches of rain in 4 days. Just not going to happen. You can manage it, you can live with it, but you're not going to control it. Very different philosophy. So, you're an engineer. You're looking to advise a client about building after that CLOMR has gone through and the floodplain's been collapsed. You know it's going to change again. But legally, you can build in an area that's going to be, frankly, flooded with a 100-year flood. It just didn't map as such. Is that okay? You go forward with it? Information is incredibly tricky. The public. How many of you, well, I won't ask that. Many of you have dealt with the public. The public is not easy to deal with. They oftentimes ask questions that are real hard to answer because you're talking to them here and they're asking a question here and you're just really talking on totally different levels. Sometimes people just don't like to have to answer questions of the public. In Houston, we're not real transparent in our decision making. Most of our decision making is done behind closed doors. Our government does not like public meetings and public hearings. Our commissioners, our county is administered by 4 elected commissioners and 1 elected county judge who's the chief administrative officer. The 5 of them routinely meet every other week. They approve 300, 400 items in 15 minutes. They don't discuss any of it publicly, or seldom do. The public is not invited to their decision-making processes. City council is a little better. They have a time when the public can actually come and talk about something before they vote on it. But generally, the citizenry is not well heard. So, how do you handle information during something like Harvey? This is something that's just breaking right now, and it's going to be, I think, a huge issue. I don't know how many of you kept up with it, but these are two big dams. There's downtown Houston. This is Interstate 10 coming west. Let's see, this is the Southwest Freeway coming out here. And Brays Bayou is sort of like this, and Buffalo Bayou runs here. White Oak Bayou comes down here. These two reservoirs were the best flooding control investment ever made in Houston. That's the Addicks Reservoir and Barker Reservoir. Addicks and Barker, they were built by use of condemnation back in the 1940s, completed by the early 1950s. These reservoirs were evaluated in 2009, and these are the words of the Corps of Engineers. They were found to be at risk of catastrophic failure. Now, that is an algorithm that leads to that assessment that includes both the probability of failure and the consequence of failure. And you have probably about 1 million people at risk with the failure, so it's a pretty serious consequence of failure, and perhaps a lower risk of failure than would be the case with other dams. But the point is, 2 of the 6 most dangerous dams are right in the middle of Houston. And they were right in the middle of Hurricane Harvey and its impacts. So the Corps of Engineers starts this process with these 2 reservoirs being at less than 100% capability. Now, I actually litigated this in federal court. This is Addicks Reservoir down here. It's the one of the 2 dams that has the potential for failure of the levee. And this is our new road system going out around Houston called the Grand Parkway. I was concerned that the new road here was going to lead to development all back in these watersheds and cause more water to flow into Addicks Reservoir and basically put more pressure on that dam. And so I went into federal court and litigated this. And actually the federal judge agreed with me. He was very concerned about it. And internally there was all sorts of emails back and forth within the Corps of Engineers where they were debating whether in fact they should issue a permit allowing that development or not. They chose to issue it. I tried to stop it. I was representing the Sierra Club. We failed to stop the road, although the judge made this whole pink area be re-examined. The point here is, first of all, is that in Houston we valued people yet to come more than we valued the people that were here. We were more intent on getting the new road system constructed than we were in protecting and kind of refurbishing, upgrading, fixing those 2 damaged reservoirs. So that's where I would start. But what's really emerged is, with regard to these 2 reservoirs, who knew what when. This is the Addicks Reservoir. And this is the area that the government owns, up to about 105 feet. This is a golf course, country club here. Now, these are homes that have been built all back in here, and the actual levee height is at least 109 feet before water starts flowing around the end of the reservoir. Well, if you look, this color here is about 100, 109, 108, 109. That takes you back up into here. The Corps of Engineers never condemned enough land for this reservoir. There was more land needed that was not condemned. It was left in private hands. The private land was developed. It was platted. It was sealed. And it was developed. The people who bought houses there never had any notice that they were buying land within basically the flood pool of Addicks Reservoir. Same thing's true on Barker Reservoir to the south. Well, here comes Tropical Storm Harvey. And the starting date of this little sequence is over here when Harvey has just strengthened into a hurricane. It's Thursday, August 24th. And the Corps of Engineers prepares this internal analysis at 7 o'clock in the morning. This, by the way, has been discovered in legal discovery associated with lawsuits arising from the probably 15,000 plus homes that were flooded by the operation of these reservoirs. This is the government-owned land. And this is Barker Reservoir, and as of Thursday, at 7 o'clock in the morning, before Harvey's even made landfall, the Corps is projecting, based on weather forecasts, that Barker's going to fill up and it's going to exceed the extent of government-owned land, which means it's going to start flooding houses. That was known Thursday. An email chain went out on Thursday. And somebody who had been briefed, or said they had been at a briefing, turned out to be the son of a commissioner, sent an email out saying, oh my gosh, you will not believe what's about to happen. And that went viral. And I received it, many of my friends received it. And this was the official response of the government to that viral email. This is our county judge, our chief county official. You can see at the time this was taken, Harvey's still well out in the Gulf of Mexico. Basically, they're addressing on online and social media email messages that have been circulating Thursday about Hurricane Harvey. Basically, the judge is saying it creates uncertainty among the public, and the public needs to know who they trust and who's giving correct information. We all try to coordinate very well, and if suddenly people start getting their news off social media, then that runs counter to what we're trying to say, and it creates a dangerous situation. This was said in dispelling the notion that there was any validity to this email chain at all. Mayor Turner was even stronger, the mayor of Houston. False forecasts and irresponsible rumors on social media are interfering with efforts by the city of Houston and its government and news media partners to provide accurate information to the public about the expected effects of Harvey. All residents of Houston and surrounding areas should rely solely on proven information sources, including National Weather Service and Office of Emergency Management, to decide how to prepare. So totally dismissing this as a false rumor. Friday, Harvey is about to make landfall on the Texas coast. Corps of Engineers internal projections. They're now projecting in both Addicks and Barker. In Addicks, it's beginning to exceed the government pool, and in Barker, it's now a solid 5 feet above the government pool, which means it's going to be going back into the developed residential areas. Saturday. This is their summary. First home flooded, 28th of August, on both Addicks, and 27th of August on Barker. We're on the 26th. Now, I will tell you, there was no warning issued officially yet. Nothing. Late Saturday evening, Fort Bend County, which is a county that has the bottom part of Barker, received some warning. A rumor, kind of the county judge began to circulate rather weakly information. Saturday, 1100 hours. Barker now is going to be 9 feet above the flood pool. Addicks is up to about, about 5 feet, 6 feet. Sunday, 800 hours. First home flooded, 28th of August. Flood depth, now we're talking 10 feet into the homes, and here we're talking about 8 feet into the homes. The official warning did not go out until late Sunday night when water started coming into houses. Now, the question is, what should have been done? This is ultimately what the flood pool elevation looked like. What should have been done? Should we have actually put out notice on Thursday? There actually was a basis for that email that went out. It was the Corps of Engineers report. The Corps was briefing the county during this whole time in the city. They just made the determination not to release the information. It was a projection. It was a computer model based on projected rainfall. Should the public have been told? And should the public have been allowed to make a decision? That's the real hard question here. How do we relate to the public? Do we trust the public? Do we think that the public is able to make sense out of information? Or do we just keep it from them and then say, oh, you need to get out now. People lost everything because they had no time to put anything up. People woke up in the middle of the night and were flooded and they did not know that the flood was coming. This was both upstream on Barker, which all of this has been about this upstream area back up in here. This is Addicks. Same thing's true with Barker. And then they started releasing water because we were up at 109 feet. Water started coming around the edge of the reservoir, and the Corps had to make a determination that they also needed to let water out because they couldn't allow that erosion around the edge to risk or endanger the reservoir. We'd never talked publicly about the danger of that reservoir. It wasn't secret information, but when I litigated and raised that in federal court, there was no newspaper coverage. No one talked about it. There was no discussion about it. We just had no public discussion, period. It becomes a very tricky issue. But bottom line was that when water started being released from Addicks downstream, Barker downstream, it also flooded a lot of people that had no warning that that flood was coming. So I would tell you it was not handled correctly, and it's going to be an issue of tremendous public debate going into elections in November. Now, the other thing is these reservoirs were at risk of failure. The Corps of Engineers had trucks staged loaded with rock, aggregate, and various types of materials to try to come in and dump into breaches that were occurring. They ran a real-time computer model of what would happen if Addicks and Barker was flooded. I have seen it. I do not have access to that document yet, but it would probably flood this area. And it's a very damning computer model that shows essentially a wave of water coming down through the community. Should that be released? Does the public have a right to know what that risk would look like? What's the duty of an engineer? What do you advise clients that are building in this area down below Addicks and Barker? If you're an engineer within the Corps, does your duty as an engineer come close to overriding chain of command? There were people within the Corps that wanted to issue this warning, and they were stopped. Tricky issues. So, where are we in Houston trying to make sense out of all of this? We've got to learn to live with flooding. Living with flooding is going to be the answer. And one of the first things about living with flooding is to be honest about it, to talk about it, to admit that the risk exists, and to try to find ways to communicate that risk. Honestly, openly, in plain English. Many of the scientists, hydrologists that I'm working with don't want to use terms like 1% or 100 year or 500 or 10,000. They want to say dangerous, really dangerous, and deadly. Really trying to give advice to people about how to treat this water. We have so often treated this water issue, this 100-year floodplain issue, as an impediment to be gotten around rather than information of importance to public safety. It has been an impediment to real estate development. It has not been information to be utilized. I think we've got that problem across the board with all of these issues. This is an interesting map. These are our hurricane evacuation zones. Hurricane surge flooding, which I haven't talked about yet, is actually more deadly than any of the rainfall, except for perhaps the collapse of Addicks and Barker reservoirs. You're from Iowa or California. You move into this area. You don't know anything about hurricanes. You don't know to ask if you're in a hurricane evacuation zone. And no one tells you. This information is not provided to you. If you're not in a, quote, 100-year floodplain, you get no information about flooding when you close a real estate deal. You could be moving into a hurricane evacuation zone that is very dangerous and get no warning about it at all. This is my favorite image in the whole presentation. This was put up by FEMA money in Precinct 2 of Harris County right after Hurricane Ike came in. And everybody was worried about surge, because Ike actually had a powerful surge for a Category 2 storm. And so they said, well, let's put up some markers in the community. This is down in the Bay Area, for those that are familiar, near where NASA is, down near Galveston Bay. And they said, okay, so this is a major intersection, like right here. And you pull up to the light at the intersection and you look over and you say, okay, a Category 4 surge would likely reach, let's say, what's that, 5 feet? And a Category 5 surge, that's about 12 feet. Way up there. You're sitting at a light looking up. And you're shopping for a house. You going to buy a house with that sign nearby? Well, on the one hand, we want the consumer to know that information. That's important information. If we were trying to protect the public, we'd have those signs all over the place. But instead, this one got taken down because it interfered with real estate sales. I would say that's going to be an issue in many communities. So what's the priority? Are we protecting the public or are we selling real estate? You're going to have to make a choice on some of these issues. And I think we're going to have to call these things out. This is a flood warning system that was set up by the Texas Medical Center. It was flooded in Tropical Storm Allison. It was the second big flood they'd had, and they said, we don't want to do it again. Dr. Bedian over at Rice went out. This is Ike. This is real-time on Ike, which came in 2008 after Allison in 2001. This system was up and running. This is real-time radar imagery. That's real-time radar imagery during the storm. These are gauges on Brays Bayou. They basically are tracking the rise of the 100-year, or rise of the water levels in Brays, matching that with the incoming rainfall and predicting when the medical center will flood. When the medical center gets a warning call from Rice, basically they have now very, very good floodgates. The floodgates go on. Everyone inside the medical center is called and said, you're not going anywhere for at least 24 hours. The medical center shut down. The people on call that are coming in are called and told, don't come. And basically the medical center protects itself. And it had no damage during Harvey, except for a backed up sewer line that came into one of the hospitals. But this is warning. Arguably not an engineered solution. This is about talking about a problem and communicating about it. And it worked absolutely beautifully. We don't have this in any other place in Harris County. This is one of the things we're hopeful of getting fixed, is to get this type of solution. Underpasses. I mean, that actually is a depth gauge. It says 4 feet. Somebody drove into it. I mean, sometimes you can't help people. On the other hand, maybe we just should have barriers that come down automatically at a certain point in time and just keeps it from happening. The Dutch have a standard that says that if one person dies, that's too many. We kill at least one person every storm in Houston because they do that. They drive into an underpass, it's flooded, and they can't get out of their car, and they suffocate, they drown. Now, our roads are our secondary drainage system in Houston, so we have a lot of water on our roads. But we can do more. Because our roads are our secondary drainage system, if you end up in a part of town that you're unfamiliar with and a big rainfall comes, where do you drive? In my neighborhood, I know which roads are the higher roads. But if I'm in someone else's neighborhood, I have no way of knowing what are the best routes to have a chance of not getting my car flooded. We could very easily put an app together that simply said, if you're caught in this area in a bad rainstorm, here's your best bet getting out. Or we could even get real-time information on what the status is. I mean, this is a traffic app. Why don't we have a flood app? Well, all of that means we have to admit, everything I'm talking about, we have to admit that we have a flood problem. But we have a flood control district. Is that governmental failure to admit that we have a flood problem? How about building water into our infrastructure? The This big area out here could protect from this storm, from this horrible event occurring, by protecting the watershed of Addicks and Barker. We could basically do all sorts of very intriguing things with food, with carbon, and with flood control, but it requires land. Land-intensive solutions have never been favored by the engineering community in Houston because they work for developers that want to develop that same land. That's where the money is, working for the developers. That may be where the big payoff is from a flood control standpoint, is figuring out how to preserve that land in creative ways with cash flow and with buying and selling ecological service credits and figuring out how to sequester carbon and pay the landowners enough money to keep them in the cattle business rather than into the land development business. But it just runs head on into everything that Houston's about. But that's an option. This is what that country looked like during the tax day flood. That water's 3 to 4 feet deep there and had tremendous infiltration. You put concrete over that, and you will worsen the situation. Unless you build retention ponds to go with it. Detention ponds don't help you on a 4-day storm. In the Netherlands, we've gotten a lot of interaction with the Dutch. And the Dutch are very popular for their serious engineering solutions, the huge gates, the Maesland barrier, which you'll see a slide about in a bit. All right, we love that. It's a huge engineering solution to solve the problem. But they also did something like this on the river wall. This used to be the levee out here. And they've moved the levee back. They've peeled it back to here. They moved the people who were in here out. And they basically made room for the river. They have cut into polters and have opened the polters up to let them flood. Reversing 1,000 years of thinking about flood control. We don't talk about that so much in Houston. They also have rigid land use controls in the Netherlands as well. We don't talk about that either. They have a very comprehensive solution. We need to call this dangerous real estate. Dangerous. It is truly dangerous. There's a portion of this that if we spent all the money that was available, we could not protect it. Period. It's just not going to get protected. On the other hand, the dark purple, the area outside the 100-year floodplain, higher up in the watersheds, better drained, not flood-proof. There's nothing that doesn't flood in Houston. But this is much better able to be drained if you evacuate the floodplain. If you put room for the river. You can integrate that into a green space system. This is a Bayou Greenways proposal on the far right-hand side that has been basically funded to the tune of $100 million to set up a trail and hiking system. You can integrate recreation with the green space and open space, making room for the river, and basically have a much safer, much sounder area. In this diagram, this red area is undeveloped land for the most part. The green is actually national wildlife refuges and wildlife management areas. Most of the green and red is undeveloped. It will flood significantly. The red area is basically below 20 feet of elevation. It will go under with a major surge. That is our target area for protection along the coast. We can do it by paying landowners to store floodwater and to store carbon. It's possible to come up with totally non-structural mechanisms for protecting this land if we'll be creative and if we'll be open to thinking about things in a different way. But that's living with flooding. That's basically saying this area is going to flood and we're not going to develop it, but we're not going to zone it because counties in Texas can't zone, and we're not going to prevent development by regulation because we'd never pass them if we could. We're going to protect them with money and with cash flow. And it'll work. In the Netherlands, every individual property owner is responsible for their own runoff. What if we did that in Houston? Every landowner is responsible for their runoff. Ooh. All of a sudden, the citizen's going to have to think about doing something. Is that reasonable to ask the citizen to handle their own runoff? So you put on a roof catchment system, store water, put a different type of lawn in. All of a sudden, we're not using as much water for our yard watering, which is 50% of our water usage. We hold water during rainfall events, and we're beginning to look at a different type of landscape for the city. But it's also one that's very effective at flooding. But it's not solving it with a single engineered solution. It's a million small solutions. This is what the Netherlands does. But this is my favorite Netherlands slide. That man's happy. He's living in his house without flooding. But his window is flood-proof. That's supposed to be the way it looks. This is what living with water looks like. It's okay. They do well. It's just different. A little hard to drive, but it's different. Hamburg. That is a grocery store here. That's a flood door, and that's a second floor entrance that is operative during flooding. They simply move up a story, and they coexist with water. They live with it. Now, could we do this in Houston? We'll see. This is all a public square, and that's the flood retention area up to this level, intended to flood. Now I'm going to switch gears on you as I kind of get toward the latter part of the presentation and talk about the bay, because the bay is different. Everything I've been talking about so far is rainfall flooding. And rainfall flooding is a huge problem. But it is not the only problem. Storm surge is the bigger one. Along Galveston Bay, this is actually, most of Houston is back over here. This is the Houston Ship Channel, probably the largest manufacturing complex, petrochemical complex. Probably it's the largest in the United States, probably second largest in the world to the Rotterdam complex. Possibly a complex in China is emerging. This is the Houston Ship Channel that goes out to here. Galveston's down here. This is an industrial area, this is an industrial area, and this is all industrial. Probably 7 major refineries, 200, 300 chemical plants in this complex, plus several 100,000 people living in the Clear Lake, League City, Texas City, Galveston kind of corridor. This is what we're really scared about. This is Hurricane Ike came in here and was a Category 2 storm. We have done computer modeling at the Speed Center at Rice. This is the worst possible place for a hurricane to make landfall from a Houston perspective. That basically throws the dirty side of the storm into the Galveston Bay system. It gets focused up here and comes up the Houston Ship Channel. That's 25 feet of surge. The 100-year floodplain is 15 feet. Most everything's protected to 15 feet. So most of the complex will go under about 10 feet. Now, Harvey was not a surge event, but one thing Harvey did do, I have had person after person in the industrial complex tell me, you guys at Speed Center are crazy. You know, that storm would just never, that would never happen. We've never seen a storm like that. It's just, you know, that's impossible. And then Harvey happened. If nothing else, Harvey has changed the impossibility of storms. If we'd have modeled that storm, they would have probably said that we were actually criminally insane. Because you're not supposed to have a Cat 4 storm, one form in 24 hours, hit the land, and then stop. That's just not supposed to happen. But it did. That's climate change. And this is a bigger storm with some sea level rise worked into it that we feel like could easily get up to 30 feet up the channel, possibly 33. We're looking at huge storm surge in the future. And this is Jamie Padgett. Many of you know Jamie. Jamie did the modeling work on basically the vulnerability of this industrial complex. She came up with the fact that with a 25-foot surge, there would be about 2,200 of 4,400 storage tanks that would be flooded. Of that, there would be a risk of failure of a certain percentage of those, which she calculated. And basically what she came up with is with a 25-foot surge, we'd have about 90 million gallons of oil and hazardous substances released. Exxon Valdez was 10 million gallons. Deepwater Horizons, 210 million. And all of that waste material would come back into the Galveston Bay system, which is probably the second most prolific estuarine area in the United States. It is ringed, particularly over here on the east side and on the south side, by a beautiful wetlands complex. So it would probably be the worst environmental disaster in United States history. It would shut down most of the military-grade jet fuel in the country, as well as affecting the price of gasoline all over the United States. So it's a big event. And to fix that, one of the alternatives that's been talked about is to come along the ship channel and make dual use of the disposal areas and turn those into a barrier, hooks into an existing levee system around Texas City, and hooks into high ground back over here. And we called it the Mid-Bay alternative, kind of from Speed Center. And an architect got a hold of it, and he's now calling it the Archipelago of Access. Perhaps a bit better name. That would include a Maseline barrier type of device on the Houston Ship Channel, right there. And it will reduce, this is a 25-foot surge that's basically pretty well handled. 33 feet, no way. But this is a $3 billion alternative. The other alternative that's being talked about is a dike along here that's 10 to 15 billion. Unlikely we will see 10 to 15 billion. I'm an environmentalist. I have fought my entire career to protect Galveston Bay, and I never thought I would be advocating putting a structure like this into the bay. Yet the alternative, the downside risk of doing nothing, is so significant that it just simply can't be ignored. And I have been castigated by my environmental friends for even having a part of it. Yet I worry that the one that I was talking about down here, this is where all the fish life, all of the estuarine organisms come and go through that main pass. This at least restricts the area that would be heavily impacted to this. One of the things we're watching very closely on congressional appropriations, there's an attempt to exempt any of these structures from environmental review. I don't want to see that. We need to have environmental review. The Netherlands have made tremendous mistakes with no environmental review. And after the fact is not the time to do it. And then, of course, the architect has to have fireworks at the end. And one of my alternatives is to start permitting this immediately. And you can build this with local money. We don't need federal money to build this one. In conclusion, I want to talk about the public. We formed a group called the Bayou City Initiative to work with the public and try to see if we can harness the energy that was really liberated by Harvey, generated by Harvey, and put it to work to do something different in our community. Because everything I've been talking to you about is politics. I mean, I've kind of dished on the engineers a little bit, so I was coming out here to the engineering school and thought I would at least throw a couple of barbs out there. That's my way of having fun, sorry. We've got 40 organizations that have joined together to try to make sense out of this whole situation about moving forward. Our big goal is to have flood literacy throughout the community. I was talking to a lot of the students today about the issue of communicating and working with the public. And my belief is the solution to these issues come from the grassroots up. Without grassroots involvement, you really don't have the nucleus to make change occur. And we're going to have to change. We cannot solve this problem by thinking the way we were thinking when we created the problem. It's one thing Einstein said that I actually think I understand. That the problems we have today cannot be solved by thinking the way we were thinking when we created these problems. We've got to think differently. And people will think differently. Politicians, maybe not. But people will. Now, if we have flood literacy, then we'll get political flood literacy. I have one thing I'm telling everybody about who to vote for. Don't vote for any candidate that cannot tell you which watersheds they represent in Harris County. Period. Now look at these gerrymandered congressional districts. I mean, it's a little hard to figure out what you do represent and how you deal with it. This is reality. This is what our congressional delegation deals with. Look at this one. Let's see, this one makes a little more sense, but, you know, by the way, this one gets much of Addicks and Barker. That's the 7th. The 7th is one of the most contested districts. But look at them all. I mean, they all look like just pieces of spaghetti thrown together. They make no sense from that type of standpoint. But if the elected politicians cannot tell you what watersheds they represent, they're not going to be able to deal with these issues. And we hope to put on training sessions for the politicians, if they'll come, where we talk about these issues, just like I'm talking to them with you today, and go through all of these things in terms of where we are and what we might need to do things differently. Now, it petrifies some of my colleagues at Rice that I'm actually doing this. But it's about the only way I've seen that we can actually have change. I've tried to litigate change. I've tried to write and cause change. And both of those have had their shortcomings. So can you work with the public from the grassroots and generate change? It's not going to be the change necessarily exactly like I wanted. It doesn't work that way. Here's what our groups say their number one goal is. Wonderful word. Everybody got to text one word to describe the concept they think is most important for the flood future of Houston. Look at those two words that have emerged at the top. Equity and transparency. Equity. What are we talking about equity? What's equity mean in this context? How about the distribution by race within the community? How about the distribution by income of the community? If you look at the Corps of Engineers benefit-cost ratio process, these are small watersheds in Houston. Our unit cost per mile of flood control is probably about the same for every watershed. If I'm doing this in a watershed where there's $4 million houses, that benefit-cost ratio is going to be way on up there. If I'm doing it in a $40,000, $50,000 house watershed, that may not make it. But it's the same number of houses, same number of probably even more people protected over here. But benefit cost won't get you there. That may be something that can be litigated. But that's what I'm trying to do. I think that's what really a lot of people in Houston are trying to do, is trying to find the issues and how you begin to think differently about these issues to bring change. Because if Houston doesn't change, our economic future is gone. We cannot continue to flood like this and pretend that it's not a problem and that we're going to fix it by just spending more money. I don't think more money is going to solve this problem. So, some come with boats and kayaks, others come with maps and words and votes, perhaps lawsuits. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Jim, for a very interesting and inspiring talk. I think we have some time for questions from the audience.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, I'm in Houston, I'm wondering about the Mayor Turner just announced some new building.
Wait, there's a mic.
Mayor Turner just announced some new building requirements.
Right.
And I'm wondering what you think of those specifically, but also kind of in this kind of interim, like we're just past Harvey's stage, what things need to get started in order for them to, prevent stuff like this from happening in the future?
Well, I mean, the debate that we're having with the city is this 500-year standard. And basically, the decision about whether we abandon the 100-year, it's agreed, it's obsolete. The question is, what do you do with it in the interim while you're developing a new map? And the discussion is to go to the 500-year level And then the devil's in the details. The city is proposing to go there, but a lot of the citizens that I'm working with actually kind of castigated me for, I just sent out a general email of support for the mayor going to the 500-year level because I thought that was a good thing. And they said, no, slow down, Blackburn. You need to look at the details and let's really look at what the fine print's about. And the real issue is about how many feet above the 500-year is the elevation going to be. And then for development outside of the floodplain, whether you can build that on fill material or whether you have to have clear passage under the house, because a lot of our problems are sheet flooding. So I would tell you the big debate is really more over sheet flooding than it is the 500-year adoption. The county adopted the 500-year, and they didn't have to worry about the rest because the county had no authority really over some of the other issues which, frankly, they just don't have authority over. And there's not much area realistically they cover. The city covers a lot of area. They have a full gamut of controls except for zoning. And there's a lot the city could be doing. And so the real question is, what are we doing about sheet flooding? 50% of our flooding in Houston is outside of the 100-year flood. So there's a large number of houses impacted outside these delineated zones. And that's really, I think, where the debate is coming down to, is to what extent should the city extend those controls into that. So it's really about, I think, the breadth of the controls and the details of that, and not so much over the wisdom of the 500 or not, which is really what I was talking to. But I like that concept, but some of these other issues are very important as well. And I've learned now to write out and say, what do you think about this idea before I send out an email saying, here's what we might do. I'm learning as well. It's humbling. Other questions? Let's see. You've got Mike coming over there. Thanks, Raquel.
There was one group of constituents I didn't hear mentioned, and I'm curious how they fit into the grand scheme of things, and that's the insurance companies and what effect they have on the entire discussion.
The insurance industry is a real wild card that I would tell you that we are very interested in learning more about. Two things to keep in mind. All of the insurance, 98, 99% of the insurance from homeowners is under the federal flood insurance program. And that is a subsidized federal program that is sort of like a hole in the federal budget. The money just sort of pours out. And thank you very much, California. Texas enjoys that largesse. Congresswoman Maxine Waters tried to pass the Bigger Waters Act to reform federal flood insurance. And we have a lot of Tea Party politicians in Texas that have been decrying the federal budget and how big it is and how it needs to be curtailed. And the price of insurance for houses down in the Bay Area, which I showed you in the last slide, went from about $750 a year to $20,000 a year under an actuarial proposal, which is where the private sector would be if they were offering insurance. And that pretty much would have ended all real estate sales in that area. And so they decried the Bigger Waters Act of 2012, and that has been amended and has been basically shut back down to allow the subsidized payments. And supposedly we're going to get to actuarial. The private insurance agency is involved two ways. One, I think they're having discussions about FEMA, in that FEMA would like to offload some of their risk onto the private sector. And so we met with Lloyd's of London, and they were saying they were having those discussions. It's not clear to me why they would participate if FEMA won't change their rules. So I would tell you that would probably be contingent upon some movement toward actuarial rates by FEMA. Otherwise, it doesn't make a lot of sense for the private insurance sector to go there. The second thing is most of those industries are self-insured to about $300 million. And then reinsurance or secondary insurance kicked in. Sort of like having a $300 million deductible policy. And then at that point, you get a kind of an umbrella policy that comes in. Swiss Re, Lloyd's, maybe a couple of other companies are involved at that level, and we're hopeful of getting their support behind one or more of these structural proposals to try to offer us some relief from storm surge. Certainly in their interest. I think individual industries are very hesitant to raise their hand and say they would like to do something because they're afraid of being asked to pay for it. And so But the private insurance is probably one of the most knowledgeable groups about these issues, and they're very sophisticated. And I think in the long term, if we could get them involved much more heavily, we'd do much better. There was a question back over here, I think.
So my question was also relating to the National Flood Home Insurance Program, and specifically it was because right now it seems that it's just money's just going down the drain. Like, how's that? How, because if from what I understand, it, as you mentioned, you have to be. It depends on the 100-year flood line, and houses that might be flooded multiple times can still pay for it. And so I wanted your thoughts on that program and whether or not houses should even be built where, a lot of flooding is known to happen.
Well, I think basically the National Flood Insurance Program, when it was first created, was set up to, on the one hand, provide some form of insurance that otherwise wasn't available in the private sector, because it had pretty much dried up into the early, mid-1960s. There just wasn't private flood insurance that was available at a reasonable cost, just because the companies felt they couldn't actually set their actuarial risk. So it was brought in as sort of an emergency stopgap program, but then the mortgage companies began to really like it because it gave them some security for loans they made in flood-prone areas. I would tell you the program has failed because it has generally aided and abetted development of floodplain areas as opposed to causing them to be evacuated. Now, we do have buyout programs under the federal program. If you're in the 100-year floodplain and have been flooded 3 or more times, you're eligible for buyout. But that means you have to be in the 100-year floodplain and you have to have purchased the insurance. So some homes have to be flooded. First time they're flooded, they don't have insurance, so then they buy insurance, and then they have to be flooded 3 more times before they can be bought out. And we're seeing some being bought out under that program. Not nearly enough and not fast enough. I think, again, the whole thing is that the flood insurance program was not designed to evacuate the floodplain. That's the bullet we have never been willing to bite. Some of this area is just too dangerous to develop, and we ought to stay out of it. My biggest proposal right now is to do all of our engineering studies, figure out how much you think you can achieve at what cost in reducing the floodplain, and there will be a strip of houses left on every one of those bayous that cannot be protected. Our first money should be to buy those out. Turn that into green space. That would give us space to work with, to do both structural and non-structural and green space solutions and work that way. But that means you don't inhabit the floodplain, at least not the most dangerous part, and that's never been part of our philosophy. And it'll be interesting to see if the people will ask for that, because some of our areas, there are cultural attachments to certain parts of town. The Jewish community is very solidly ensconced in the Meyerland area of Houston, and many of the synagogues and many of the cultural center points are right on Brace Bayou in one of the worst flood-prone areas. And the community feels like they're under attack for their existence. And if you're the big buyout and all of a sudden you remove the community from their cultural center, what does that do to the community? Same thing with several African-American communities on the east side of town. Same type of issue for cultural long-term stability. And buyouts can be a very harsh alternative. But in the long term, I think that's what we're going to see a lot of. And there are ways to minimize. If we tie housing to buyouts and make sure people that are bought out have houses to go to, that can be helpful. But that flood insurance program right now is not helping, other than it provides money to people that get flooded, but at the cost to the rest of the citizens of the United States. And we're not solving the problem. Back over here.
It really seems like buyouts are a good option, but I know that eminent domain is something that's a very controversial issue and something that the public is not always for. So have you ever heard a lot of backlash from the public, and has the public stance on using buyouts to open up more green space changed after Harvey, or has it still remained the same?
I think actually the public would be angry to have it characterized as buying out to provide green space. I think it has to be bought out to provide a comprehensive concept of flood management, making room for the river as opposed to making room for green space, making room for the bayous, making room for the water. So I think to some extent that term green space versus my house doesn't resonate nearly as well as managing the water versus my house. So I think some of it is kind of how they perceive something coming at him. Eminent domain is not favored in Houston, in Texas as a general proposition. It's a harsh remedy. I think there is sentiment for that. I think that one of the high points of the slide that's up, this is the volunteers that came out, and basically a lot of people were rescued by individuals that brought their own boats out. But our first responders are at risk every time there's a flood. And I think most people understand that. And this is sort of what we're most proud of as a community. We do this well. We help each other in times of horrible disasters very well. On the other hand, we also, I think, will listen if it's about keeping the first responders from time and time again being put at risk to rescue the same houses and the same families. And I think that is how eminent domain becomes a viable public option, is really with respect to thinking of it in terms of what the harm that you're putting other people into so that you can continue to live in a very dangerous area. That's, I think, the way that issue resonates. Oh, there's a question.
You talked a lot about grassroots movement for creating change in Houston. You also mentioned you have a governor that does not believe in climate change. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the difficulties of talking about with the general public issues like global warming when it's become an issue that has been so political.
It's a very, very tricky issue in Texas, as you might imagine. I find that I can talk about climate change to every oil company in town and have some very interesting, very sophisticated conversations, and they're on the brink of doing, I think, some very creative and I think what will be very surprising things in the not-too-distant future. I think, on the other hand, the politicians are who we just can't talk to. I mean, the politicians are just close to it. And so I think that where the grassroots makes it, public believes the climate's changing. I mean, you live in Houston and you keep seeing storms you've never seen before. It begins to resonate. Now, there is code for climate change in Texas. Weird weather. That's code for climate change. And if you work for the state of Texas, there are some people that are afraid they'll get fired if they talk about climate change. So, on the one hand, the oppression is amazing. On another level, the understanding of it is much broader than you would think. And I started writing almost immediately after Harvey. I've actually been writing a bit about this before Harvey. And I put out a couple of papers, and they were well received. And I got several emails from saying, Blackburn, you're doing really great, but don't talk about climate change. Because the worry was that I was going to diminish my credibility. Of course, I talked about climate change. I can't help myself. But I think the point being that the public is there. It's not really that many. I won't tell you 100% of them are. But I'm not having any problem with climate change acceptance in Houston among the public I'm talking to. That's really never not been an issue. It's just not something we talk about. We go straight to strategy. I think that where it becomes a problem is to the extent that we're talking about this 100-year flood and trying to get in front of it. You have to accept that climate is changing, that the storms will be increasing, and that we're heading in that direction. And so maybe it's not 17 inches in 24 hours, it might be more like 22. To get that type of acceptance, to go to a higher number, that requires somebody at the governmental level to accept the climate is changing. And that's where we're running into just a brick wall. We can, as long as it's statistically based, as long as it's based on collected data, we can go there. Now, the one that gets tough is the Gulf of Mexico. It is getting hotter. The numbers are there. The storms are fueled by hot water. I mean, that's pretty clear. Evaporation, you get more with hotter temperatures. Hot air can hold more water. All of that translates into 42, 46 inches of rain in 4 days. The public gets that. So I think the days of not talking about it are over. Whether we're at the point of doing something's different. I don't anticipate Texas passing a carbon regulatory program like what you have in California anytime soon. So, any other questions?
I think
Back
we have
there,
time for
Rick.
one last question.
Yeah, it's my understanding that the FEMA process for reviewing their 100-year maps, it's redone every 10 or 15 years. Do you have any recommendations for how frequently and how should that be done, given that you have two factors here? One is climate change, the other is urban growth that changes the boundary conditions all the time.
Right. I think it's a real problem of how kind of routinely FEMA flooding is redone. Now, something that's not widely known about Harris County is that back during the Reagan administration, Harris County got permission under contract from FEMA to do its own mapping. So our local engineering firms do, under contract to Harris County Flood Control District, do actually our flood analysis. And that was a pretty wild process for many years where we would change floodplains with letters of map revision and things like that very frequently. I litigated a couple of floodplain maps after Tropical Storm Allison. We updated everything really to catch up with land use. We didn't change rainfall very much, but we did update land use and did much better detailed topography. And that was a comprehensive overview and to update in 2001. We're getting ready to do that again. But there's a lot that's done unofficially with letters of map revision, and that's a process. The New York Times has written a couple of articles about how that has frankly diminished the protection that people get, because with a letter of map revision you can take an area out of the 100-year floodplain and there's no real indication that it was ever mapped as being in the 100-year floodplain. And that's been abused in several instances. And some of the worst flooding I've seen on some of the water courses was where there were letters of map revision that were done and areas were withdrawn from a floodplain and then they flooded. And the people had no idea they were in the 100-year floodplain. They didn't buy flood insurance, and they were basically unprotected. But again, it's part of this whole FEMA process. I mean, it's just almost too unwieldy to really be functional. It's a very slow animal. Harris County jumped in and got permission to redo its floodplain maps because it didn't like the first set that came out. Thought the floodplains were too big. So our government has spent 30 years arguing for smaller floodplains. That's been our philosophy. This was an impediment to development. It was not a warning sign to the public. And so that mindset has never really changed and may not change after Harvey, but it's got a better chance to now than it did before that. But I think we're all at fault for not talking about it as a danger zone. It's just an impediment, not a danger zone. And I don't think anything could be further from the truth.
Jim, it was very thought-provoking and leaves us... Oh.
What?
Apparently Mike's not working. Oh. I'm wondering, do you think that within the next 50, 100 years that cities like Houston will become unlivable?
Well, I think they'll be unlivable if we think we can control flooding. I think the Netherlands has been dealing with this for a long time, and it's very livable. But I think they live with water, and they also live with constantly thinking about it and constantly pushing it back, working with it, letting it come in. So I think mindset-wise, with the current mindset, Houston's doomed. I have no doubt that its future is very limited with the current mindset. With a mindset of beginning to accept and live with water, to change that philosophy and kind of welcome water into the design of the city, I think it's got a great future. But I think it's going to be a landmark city if it does that. Because it will be the first city in the world probably to take this on head-on and change their philosophy of development. I'm just not sure we can do it. But what I do know is the engineering community is right in the middle of it. And that's why I've begun to challenge the engineering community more and more, because they're in a unique position to have a major influence in how this emerges, if they will collectively come together. Now, if it turns out that 2 or 3 or 4 take a position that's strong and the others kind of go back to where we were, then these will just not get a lot of work. And that could be a bad deal. On the other hand, if there's unity, if there's commitment, that's a piece. But I think there is a future for Houston with these big storms. But it's going to be a very different future than what we've got. And I would say what most people think we're going to have ahead of us. I don't think we've seen anything yet. Thank you very much. I appreciated being here.
Thank you, Jim.